It was 50 years ago tonight the Rolling Stones performed live for the first time.
They started out as soulmates in sound, two rebels bonded by blues, bootlegs, and a hunger for something real. But somewhere between smoky clubs and stadium lights, that brotherhood began to splinter. What happens when a creative partnership outlives the friendship that built it? Behind the riffs, the records, and the roaring crowds, another story was unfolding, one laced with rivalries, betrayals, and wounds that never fully healed. You might think you know how it ends, but there's one quiet insult and one final album that could change how you see it all. So, how deep does the rift go, and what held it together through the cracks? The blues before the breakup. In the early 1960s, the quiet English town of Dartford played host to a fateful reunion that would shape the course of rock history. Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, childhood acquaintances who had lost touch, reconnected on a train platform, Jagger carrying vinyl records of Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters under his arm. That moment wasn't just serendipitous. It ignited a musical bond built on mutual obsession with American blues, a genre that felt exotic and rebellious in post-war Britain. For both young men, blues became a doorway not only into music, but into self-expression, far beyond what the British pop scene then offered. By 1962, their shared passion evolved into practice. Alongside Dick Taylor and others, Keith and Mick formed a loose ensemble, often dubbed the Blues Boys. They weren't chasing fame yet. They were chasing the sound of Chicago's South Side, trying to recreate the licks of Jimmy Reed and the rawness of Howlin' Wolf with borrowed guitars and makeshift amps. Keith, in particular, was enthralled by the directness of blues, the honesty, the grit. He once described hearing Muddy Waters for the first time as like discovering life in black and white turning into color. Their commitment to the form wasn't academic. It was visceral and obsessive. When Andrew Loog Oldham came into the picture and motivated the group to create original music, both Mick and Keith literally had to learn to find a new self. They were not custodians of their heroes anymore. They were shaping their sound. Early songs would be balladic, like As Tears Go By, yet were rooted in blood and structure, by the same instrumentation and vocal phrasing that marked American blues strains in their most extreme. 2 years later, in 1964, the debut album was still literally drenched in covers, but the transformation had taken off. Blues were no source. It was also a blueprint for inventiveness, even as market pressures started to push them towards a wider audience. But with the coming of 1965, the cracks began to form. While the band members built up the Stones' international fame, all egalitarian intimacy of the early days began to give way to collateral visions. Mick began to lean toward the showman persona, working half-polished, half-charming, while Keith reaffirmed his hold on the blues. Where Mick saw a breeding ground, Keith saw a departure from it all, considered treason against the very soul they had ever lived and breathed. The Glimmer Twins were in many ways still good working partners, but slowly, yet surely, the purity of their creative bond was fading into the realms of ego, image, and ambition, infinitely into territory they had previously only known and ever cared for. Yet even the strongest riffs can't drown out what happens when emotion enters the equation. Marianne and the Rift. In the mid-1960s, Marianne Faithfull entered the Rolling Stones' orbit, not just as a rising singer, but as a cultural force of her own. Discovered by Andrew Loog Oldham, her debut with As Tears Go By, co-written by Jagger, was the first visible thread tying her to the band. But what began as professional collaboration quickly evolved into a high-profile romance between her and Mick. They became emblematic of swinging London. Youthful, stylish, and subversive, Marianne wasn't just a muse, she was a central presence in the Stones' creative ecosystem, inspiring both sonic experimentation and deeper lyrical introspection. As Marianne and Mick grew closer, their dynamic disrupted more than headlines. It disrupted the balance between Mick and Keith. Keith, who had once considered Marianne a close companion, began to feel her influence as a wedge rather than a bridge. He later revealed in Life that rumors swirled around her involvement with their circle's substance suppliers, stories that left him uneasy and betrayed. The shared time the trio spent at Redlands, a bohemian refuge for the band, became increasingly charged. It was a setting meant for artistic escape, yet beneath the surface, personal fault lines were widening between the two founding stones. Faithful's dealings with Mick became grave through substance addiction, depression, and legal troubles. After suffering a harrowing miscarriage, she went into hiding while Mick, burdened with never-ending emotional withdrawals, focused on music. Keith's sympathies oscillated between pity and rage. For one, he could not bear the idea of a woman he cared about falling apart in the fierce glare of public adoration. On the other hand, her suffering seemed to be met with indifference from the very man she trusted most. To Keith, it was not merely the failure of a romance, it was the perception of emotional abandonment by a friend who should have done more. Years down the line, Keith will realize this moment as the defining fracture in his relationship with Mick. The whole emotional carnage accompanying the fall of Marianne, along with what Keith perceived as Mick's coldness during her darkest hours, stole that chance with cement. Trust eroded. Where once they used to be conspirators in rebellion blues, now they are men walking divergent paths. One becomes the face of the establishment after the initial spark. Another hangs on to the soul of their origins. Marianne's story haunted not only the myth of the band itself, but it also stood as a defining shadow on how personal decisions and romantic entanglements could shred even the deepest artistic partnerships. Redlands Raid. In February 1967, the Rolling Stones' counterculture lifestyle collided with Britain's conservative establishment in a way that would echo for decades. Acting on a tip believed to have been planted by News of the World, who had just been challenged by Mick Jagger in a libel suit, police raided Keith Richards' Redlands estate in West Wittering. Inside, they found a scene lifted straight from the pages of London's underground elite: psychedelic substances, free-spirited guests, and Marianne Faithfull wrapped only in a fur rug, a detail tabloids would sensationalize for years. Keith, tripping on LSD, was so unfazed that he mistook the officers for cartoon characters. It was surreal, chaotic, and unforgettable. The raid quickly became a media circus. Mick was arrested for possession of amphetamines, and Keith for allowing cannabis use on his property. Both men were jailed overnight, then released on bail. The press pounced, and the case stirred national debate. The Stones' single, "We Love You," complete with a promotional video parodying their courtroom appearances, was a defiant response. But perhaps more impactful was the Times editorial, "Who Breaks a Butterfly on a Wheel?", which challenged the harshness of their treatment and cast them as martyrs for a generation hungry for rebellion. Public sympathy poured in, and the Stones' status as cultural revolutionaries was solidified. Yet, according to a surface interpretation, the show was perfect. Already within was what Keith remembered as turning phases from the chaos of litigation. Michael, however, appeared secluded from the public and propped his counterposition more with techniques that would control the public viewing than otherwise. It was hardly the elated celebration he'd envisioned, while the mere conviction against him was overthrown, and that of Mick reduced to a conditional discharge. He sensed withdrawal instead. In interviews and his memoir, he described feeling alone and emotionally distanced from the friend who had at one time stood shoulder to shoulder with him through it all. The public, of course, saw camaraderie, but Keith knew differently. He witnessed the slow, almost torturous disassociation already beginning. For Keith, Redlands was more than just the name of an article, more than just the site of a substance bust. It was the symbolic end of innocence within the Rolling Stones narrative. What started as a badge of collective defiance gradually became the reference point for betrayal. The raid was the trial by fire, he said. While they emerged as free men, not without scars. The personal aftermath, specifically Keith's feeling of abandonment, lasted long after charges were dropped. With Redlands, we find the first real fracture in the Jagger-Richards axis. It was a barely perceptible but completely seismic tremor that would reverberate through every album, rehearsal, and tour that followed. The LSD years. In the mid to late 1960s, the Rolling Stones were swept up in the psychedelic revolution, and LSD became more than a recreational escape. It was a perceived doorway to deeper creative expression. For Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, the early experiments with acid seemed to push boundaries both musically and spiritually. Their shared trips fueled the dreamlike, often chaotic aesthetic of their Satanic Majesty's Request, an album that marked the peak of their hallucinogenic era. The record wasn't just a sonic detour, it was a reflection of the Stones attempting to keep pace with a world in flux, where experimentation was increasingly seen as a badge of artistic legitimacy. But while LSD initially fostered a new level of openness and connection between bandmates, it soon began revealing stark differences in their core personalities. Keith embraced the trippy experience as an extension of his blues-rooted identity, blending it with a raw, improvisational approach to music. Mick, on the other hand, started shifting toward performance and persona. Keith later remarked that Mick seemed to become more theatrical and image-conscious, particularly during and after their psychedelic peak. What had once been a shared journey into sound and self-exploration started to evolve into a silent competition, one man searching inward, the other projecting outward. While the onset of acid haze had begun to clear, the band moved back toward a grittier rock sound with albums like Beggar's Banquet and Exile on Main Saint. But by that time, the creative imbalance had begun to set in. Increasingly, Keith felt himself being sidelined as Mick exerted more and more control over the themes and visuals of the band. Keith was aghast at what he saw as the band's drifting from its emotional home in American blues and into a kind of cultural pageantry that he felt was a betrayal of their roots. As the records were still his stage on which to play his riffs and harmonies, the whole narrative appeared to him, spearheaded by Mick's persona, as a play he wasn't allowed to rewrite. Keith's interpretation of this period, on the whole, is that it is not a creative renaissance, but rather a slow beginning to divergence. Although the music produced during this time reverberates as some of their most experimental, the very personal and artistic chasm between the Glimmer Twins would only deepen in subtle, irreversible ways. Psychedelics expanded their minds, but also exposed fault lines in their friendship. As fame deepened further and egos went higher, the mystical brotherhood that began on blues records and late-night jam sessions eventually began to tear apart, one acid tab and studio session at a time. Sticky Fingers and Slippery Credits. By the time the Rolling Stones released Sticky Fingers in 1971, the creative tension between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards was no longer just a matter of personality. It had seeped directly into the fabric of their music. The album, widely regarded as one of their greatest, featured iconic tracks like Brown Sugar, Wild Horses, and Bitch, songs often driven by Keith's gritty guitar work and rhythmic intuition. Yet, despite his heavy lifting in both songwriting and arrangement, everything was credited under the joint banner of Jagger-Richards. For Keith, this wasn't a collaboration in name only, it was an erosion of individual contribution, disguised as unity. While the duo had long agreed on shared credits, Keith increasingly felt the scale tipping toward Mick, both in publishing rights and creative control. Mick, who had begun assuming more authority in business dealings and production, shaped much of Sticky Fingers' direction. Keith, meanwhile, contributed signature riffs and raw power, yet found himself excluded from key decisions. The frustration wasn't simply about money, it was about authorship and identity. The growing imbalance in recognition hinted at a broader shift in the band's dynamic, where Mick's managerial instincts were beginning to eclipse Keith's musical instincts. The year 1973 had Goat's Head Soup as a not-so-glorious sequel that had dimmer themes, sullenness, and internal exhaustion. If Keith's emotion-ridden and vulnerable contributions to songs like Coming Down Again became visible, much of the general imprint of the album continues to show the influence of Mick's increasingly stylized direction. The addition of Mick Taylor, whose uncredited input on Moonlight Mile and other tracks raised eyebrows, added yet another layer of discontent. Taylor would later voice his disillusionment over being denied songwriting recognition, echoing Keith's sense of being pushed to the margins. For Keith, these examples were not isolated, but part of a larger pattern of creative minimization. By the mid-1970s, what originally had begun as a musical brotherhood based on mutual respect was slowly turned into, instead, a relationship of working necessity and pragmatism. Keith began to feel he was a contributor rather than a partner, instrumental in the sound but peripheral to the vision. The Jagger-Richards credit lingered on, but it was an umbrella concealing a lopsided collaboration where the Stones' future gradually slipped from Keith's control. Sticky Fingers may have provided the perfect picture of the band's creative peak, but for Keith, it also heralded the beginning of a more profound loss. Not just fame or skill, but joint authorship and the faith that was once invested in it. But just when it seemed the scales couldn't tilt further, one move would test their partnership like never before. Jagger goes it alone. By the early 1980s, the Rolling Stones had survived substance busts, personal feuds, and a changing musical landscape, but nothing shook the foundation of the band quite like Mick Jagger's solo ambitions. Without warning, his longtime creative partner, Mick, signed a solo deal with CBS and began work on what would become She's the Boss, 1985. For Keith Richards, the move was more than a surprise. It was a breach of loyalty. The Stones had always operated under an unspoken pact that no matter how chaotic things got, the band came first. In Keith's view, Mick broke that bond the moment he prioritized a solo career over their shared legacy. The impact was immediate and corrosive. While the rest of the band slogged through the sessions for Dirty Work, 1986, Mick was absent for large chunks of the recording process, often sending his vocals in remotely. Keith, already battling his own demons, took the reins with support from Charlie Watts and Ronnie Wood, trying to keep the band's identity intact. The fact that Mick also chose to perform at Live Aid in 1985 without involving the Stones only intensified the divide. Keith later described the period as World War III, a Cold War of egos fought through scheduling conflicts, passive-aggressive interviews, and creative power plays. By the same token, says Mick, his solo career fell short of the targets it was supposed to meet. She's the Boss sounded pretty commercial, but lacked the grit and soul of a Stones record. And the follow-up, Primitive Cool, 1987, fared worse still, by critics and commercially. At the same time, the first attempt at a solo album from Keith, Talk Is Cheap, in 1988, was a critical and audience success, his being acclaimed by them as a triumphant return to form, raw and rebellious, with a 100% Rolling Stones DNA. For Keith, this success was both a vindication and an illumination. He had been his entire life a sideman, and now he had discovered he could actually lead a band, write great songs, and carry the spirit of rock without Mick above him. In 1989, necessity banded the Stones together once more for Steel Wheels, but the reunion weighed more toward survival than reconciliation. With scrutiny on their backs regarding the money from touring and losing grip on relevance, the two men considered putting personal grievances aside for now. The tour that followed was a commercial success, yet the friendship remained severely strained. Underneath their smiles and pretense on stage, Keith held on to the fact that Mick had betrayed him. He may have come back into the fold, but that breaking of trust was very deep. Mick had gone solo, and by now, Though they were still working, the Stones had ripped their invisible contract in two. Backstage blowouts and onstage ice. As the Rolling Stones entered the 1980s, the legendary chemistry between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards began to visibly erode. In the studio, what had once been a fluid exchange of ideas turned into a careful dance of avoidance. During the recording of Emotional Rescue and Tattoo You, the two often worked at separate times, Mick arriving midday, Keith staying late into the night. Their recording schedules barely overlapped, and when they did, the energy was tense and transactional. Co-producer Chris Kimsey later remarked that it became obvious the two were doing everything they could to avoid direct collaboration. The air was thick with unspoken resentment, and the band's musical output bore the strain. Behind the scenes, things were no better. The feud that began with Mick's solo ambitions now festered into open hostility. During the making of Dirty Work, Jagger's limited presence in the studio only fueled Keith's fury. Richards reportedly scrawled insults in Mick's lyric books, and arguments broke out over everything from production choices to tour plans. One infamous incident saw the two nearly come to blows over who had the final say in the band's direction. It wasn't just a creative clash, it was personal. Keith saw himself as the guardian of the Stones' soul. Mick, in his eyes, was compromising that legacy for personal gain. And sooner or later, it spilled out onto the stage. By the time of the Steel Wheels Tarchak's Urban Jungle Tour, 1989-90, whatever spontaneous impulse had once existed in the relationship between Mick and Keith had long ago been replaced by choreography and distance. Those once familiar lean-in moments in which the two would share a mic with grinning mischief now look not just enforced, but almost contractual rather than magical. Even the fans have begun to comment on it. These nights have seen tighter set lists, more polished performances, but missing the one element that could set them alight. Every glance exchanged seemed staged, every interaction carefully orchestrated to prevent revealing fissures in their relationship. The Cold War was also continued off stage. By the 1990s, backstage whispers became shouts. While never completely loud, the silences could hardly be mistaken for anything other than hostility. Rehearsals became emotional minefields, with the rest of the band acting as the safety zones. Walking out shoulder to shoulder felt routine. The partner in the exercise looked more like a boardroom than a band of brothers. Muscle memory and sheer professionalism held the music together, but what held it together had changed. It had been fire and friction producing brilliance. Now it was frost, with the result of too many wars, too many betrayals, and far too little left unsaid. The Brenda insult. By the time Keith Richards published his explosive 2010 memoir Life, a nickname that had long circulated behind closed doors suddenly entered the public spotlight. Brenda. It wasn't just a private joke. It was Keith's sharpest jab at Mick Jagger's perceived descent into vanity and self-importance. Within the Rolling Stones' inner circle, Brenda became shorthand for the Mick who obsessed over his image, bossed people around, and, in Keith's eyes, abandoned the grounded spirit that had once defined their music. According to Keith, it wasn't unusual for crew and bandmates to use the nickname while Mick was in the room, turning ridicule into a kind of quiet rebellion. The insult didn't come out of nowhere. It emerged after years of Keith watching Mick, once a fellow blues obsessive in tight jeans and t-shirts, transform into a globe-trotting frontman with custom-tailored suits and personal stylists. Keith saw this not as evolution, but artifice. In interviews and on stage, Mick had become more brand than bandmate, someone who curated his persona with the same intensity he once reserved for lyrics. Keith, ever rooted in rawness and authenticity, couldn't relate. The nickname Brenda was his way of voicing that disconnect, a snide marker for the man he no longer recognized. But undercutting all of it was a deeper emotional wound. Keith really showed the sadness behind the insult in life. Keith writes of missing his friend with whom he used to jam until the early hours of the morning, a partner in rebellion and rhythm. The barbs about Mick's ego, and even his anatomy, some real shockers, mask a more complex reality. Keith felt abandoned. Where once they shared everything, from music to women to dirty apartments, now it seemed they could barely exchange eye contact. It was perhaps a jest gone too far, a joke turned into a defense. Keith's act of wresting power back in a situation by now totally out of his grasp. The fans online examined the nickname with equal parts envy and consideration. Over in the Reddit dimension, users said it wasn't just Keith messing with someone. Keith was heartbroken. In Stones' mythology, the Glimmer twins had always represented a balance. Mick, the more extroverted one, and Keith, the heart-natured one. By the time Life came out, that balance had collapsed into caricature. Brenda was not just a name. It was Keith's muted scream for the brotherhood they had lost, and a not-so-subtle reminder that, in spite of the stadium's fame and successful lives, some bitterness still resided in place of blues and friendship. A book full of shots. When Keith Richards released his memoir, Life, in 2010, it wasn't just a tell-all, it was a public reckoning. Across its pages, Richards offered a brutally honest, often darkly humorous look into his tumultuous existence, substance addiction, brushes with death, the cost of fame, and the music that made it all bearable. But nothing drew more headlines or shocked longtime fans more than his unfiltered takedown of Mick Jagger. Keith mocked everything from Mick's ego to his voice to, infamously, the size of his anatomy. He pulled no punches, calling Mick unbearable and accusing him of forgetting where they came from. For decades, the public had speculated about tension within the band. Life confirmed it in full technicolor. The most cutting remarks weren't just about Mick's physical quirks, they were about his personality. Keith accused Jagger of becoming obsessed with power and control, surrounding himself with sycophants, and valuing image over authenticity. According to Keith, Mick had drifted away from the blues foundation that once united them, trading grit for glamour. Keith wrote that Jagger had become a bit of a showbiz queen, managing the Stones like a corporation instead of a band of brothers. He wasn't just airing grievances, he was rewriting the story of the Stones' inner world from his perspective, offering a narrative where Mick had slowly hijacked what once belonged to both of them. Their opinions were expressed as shock at such a candid display. From GQ to The Guardian, the critics have called the book everything from raw to scorched earth, and even Shakespearean in its depiction of a partnership twisted by fame. For some, Keith is a vindictive individual, while for others, he is an icon of honesty. It is not very often that you come across a rock star of his size who dares to speak out like that regarding jealousy, sorrow, and disappointment. Disappointment not from some collaborator, but from someone who once was like a brother. The jabs about Mick's lifestyle are sharp, but the biggest blows are the reflections, an almost no longer dream day's remembrance, with Keith reminiscing about the good times, not before a party, but through endless songwriting sessions. However, there was more going on beneath the derision and animosity. In one of the most surprising confessions in the book, Keith wrote, "I still love him dearly." It was a line that vulnerably cut through the venom. Life was more than just a memoir. It was a message, one that was both nostalgic and defiant. It served as a reminder to the world that the Glimmer twins were more than just rock stars. They were flawed, human, and intricately linked. And in spite of his resentment, Keith left the door slightly open, implying that the connection created in youth, rebellion, and blues would not be completely destroyed even after decades of betrayal. And just when it seemed the ink had dried on their fallout, a surprising collaboration reignited old sparks. The Hackney Diamonds. When the Rolling Stones released Hackney Diamonds in October 2023, it marked their first album of original material in 18 years. For fans, It felt like both a miracle and a mystery. How had Mick Jagger and Keith Richards managed to work together again after decades of barely concealed friction? The album arrived not just as a new musical chapter, but as a symbol of something deeper, potential reconciliation. With sessions taking place across multiple cities and featuring both longtime collaborators and new blood, including Steve Jordan replacing the late Charlie Watts, the album bridged the band's legacy with the reality of its aging but enduring members. Public appearances surrounding the release, including their high-profile Hackney press conference with Jimmy Fallon, suggested a functional alliance. Keith spoke of renewed energy and praised the urgency of their studio process, even hinting at moments of spontaneous creativity. Yet, under the surface, the dynamic between Mick and Keith remained professional more than personal. In interviews, Keith acknowledged that while the band was still tight, old wounds weren't exactly healed. They were simply scarred over. He emphasized structure, deadlines, and discipline, terms more akin to a business than the fiery, chaotic camaraderie that once defined their creative process. The music was a fitting statement of its contradicting attributes. Tracks like Angry and Driving Me Too Hard swelled with swagger and strut of the classic sound, but were in emotional underpinnings more thoughtful than rebellious. Critics cited the sophisticated production on the album as a contrast to the older, raw spirit in their work. Keith's tracks in particular, low-key and honest tracks like Tell Me Straight, stood out for their poignant emotional impact. Pitchfork and NME reviewers noted that the Stones were not yet over the hill, though there was an unmistakable change. This is no longer brotherhood songwriting, but songs born from experience, history, and the resilience of the heart. In the end, Hackney Diamonds may have failed to bring Mick and Keith together as friends, but it would seal forever their musical bond. From a muse of passion and friendship, that which formed their lives now functions on mutual respect and decades of interdependence. The Glimmer twins may never again enjoy such intimacy, but they do not need to now. It is recognition, not forgiveness, that this treaty entails. After fighting, creating, and redefining rock and roll for 60 years, they have chosen to carry the torch together. It may not be as brothers, but rather as co-authors of a legacy neither could finish alone. If you enjoyed this dive into rock's most complicated duo, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more deep cuts, and drop a comment. What's your take on the Jagger-Richards saga? Did they make peace or just make it work? And hey, don't stop now. Check out the next video on screen for another untold story behind the music. Keep watching, and we'll see you there.